inflation is a disease. It's a dangerous disease for a society. It is sometimes a fatal disease for a society. It's a disease that, if allowed to rage unchecked, can destroy a society. And we have many such examples. The classic examples, of course, are the extreme examples of Germany, of Austria, of Russia, after the First World War, when inflation reached levels at which employers would pay their workers 3 times a day after breakfast, lunch, and dinner so they could go out and spend the money before it lost all its value. That's the real extreme cases. But you don't have to go to such extreme cases to see the enormous harm which inflation left unchecked can do. You have the example in many examples in South America. Brazil, before 1964, was brought down by an inflation that led to a revolution that toppled the existing government in order to stem the inflation. In the famous case of Chile, with Mr. Allende in power, he produced an inflation, which was one of the major factors that caused the economic catastrophe that led to the replacement of his government by a military dictatorship. We are nowhere near that stage in the United States, but it behooves us as a nation to pay attention to this disease, to ask ourselves, what is the cause of the disease? How do you cure the disease? What are the effects of the cure? What are the side effects of it? And what will happen if we don't cure it? Now, the first step toward understanding the cause of inflation is to recognize that it is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It's always and everywhere a result of too much money, of a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than an output. Moreover, in the modern era, the important next step is to recognize that today governments control the quantity of money, so that as a result, inflation in the United States is made in Washington and nowhere else. Of course, no government any more than any one of us likes to take responsibility for bad things. We're all of us human. If something bad happens, it wasn't our fault. And the government is the same way. So it doesn't accept responsibility for inflation. If you listen to people in Washington talk, they will tell you that inflation is produced by greedy businessmen, or it's produced by grasping unions, or it's produced by spendthrift consumers, or maybe it's those terrible Arab sheiks who are producing it. Now, of course, businessmen are greedy. Who of us isn't? Trade unions are grasping. Who of us isn't? And there's no doubt that the consumer is a spendthrift. At least every man knows that about his wife. But none of them produce inflation, for the very simple reason that neither the businessman, nor the trade union, nor the housewife has a printing press in their basement on which they can turn out those green pieces of paper we call money. Only Washington has that printing press, and therefore only Washington can produce inflation. Now, in saying that inflation is a printing press phenomenon, in saying that inflation is always caused by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than an output, you're only at the beginning of the problem, because you must distinguish the immediate cause from the more ultimate cause. You must ask, why is it that the quantity of money increases too rapidly? But before I go on to that question, I just want to settle for once and for all the point that inflation is a monetary phenomenon. That proposition has been documented over and over again. We have evidence for the United States for over 100 years, for Great Britain for 200 years, for Sweden for 200 years. There has never in history been an inflation that was not accompanied by an extremely rapid increase in the quantity of money. There has never in history been an extremely rapid increase in the quantity of money without an inflation. But in order to persuade you of this quickly and with a minimum waste of time, I have brought a few pictures along to show you that will graphically illustrate the proposition about the relation between money and inflation. And I'd like to, if we can start with the first of those slides now. Maybe you can make out that there are two lines on that chart. That chart is for the United States, and it covers the 13 years from 1964 through 1976. And one of those charts, the solid line, is the quantity of money per unit of output. And the other line, which is a dashed line, is the consumer price index. Those two lines cross at 1970 because that's the way they're constructed. Both of those series were expressed on 1970 as a base of 100 in order to try to get the two series in the same scale. But there is nothing whatsoever in the arithmetic of it to make those two curves the same elsewhere. And I may say that the quantity of money that's plotted there is a quantity of money for a year ending 6 months before the price index. So that you are not, there's nothing funny about that. And you can see that the two lines are almost indistinguishable. Now, I've got a segment of 13 years up there, but if I had a segment of 100 years, the relationship would be the same way throughout the whole of that period. But you may say that's only for the United States. But what about other countries? And so let's have the next slide. The next slide is for Germany for the same period. And again, you will see the same story. Now, the interesting thing here is that you can see that the quantity of money for a while in the later in the 70s was running ahead of the price index, but now they're coming back together again. And that's a behavior you very often observe. The quantity of money per unit of output is a major factor that from the immediate sense determines the price index, but it doesn't operate instantaneously. Sometimes there are delays of a year or two, but sooner or later they all come back together. Well, the United States and Germany are very similar countries. What about another country? Let's have the third chart. That's for Japan, and you will notice that Japan experienced a much greater price rise than either the United States or Germany did. But Japan has now been coming back. It's done a remarkable job of controlling the quantity of money, and as a result, the rate of price inflation in Japan has come down from close to 30% a year to where today, in the period after this chart, it's back down to about 7%. But again, you have the same synchronism between the two charts. Now, the next chart, let's have the next chart, which is for Great Britain. You can see each one of these has a little bit more inflation than the preceding one, but each one of them, you again have the same relationship in every case between the quantity of money and prices. Now, one of the interesting things about that comparison between Japan and the United Kingdom is you will hear many people telling you that the real reason you have inflation is because of trade unions. If you listen to anybody telling you about Great Britain's plight, they will tell you that the real problem in Great Britain is that you have such strong trade unions that they push up wages and that causes inflation. Well, if that explains this relationship for Britain, what explains the previous chart for Japan, where trade unions are not very important or much weaker than they are in Great Britain? Or what explains the next chart, which is a honey for Brazil? Can we have the last chart? Now that's an inflation that's really an inflation. That's none of these baby inflations we've been playing with. Of course, there are still better ones in Argentina and Chile, but we don't have a big enough room. Now here again, if trade unions cause inflation, as you know, Brazil has a military government, And trade unions have absolutely nothing to say about anything except as they are branches of the government apparatus. So that it's clear you cannot explain, in the case of Brazil, the inflation by trade unions, but you can see very clearly that you can explain it by changes in the quantity of money. Thank you. We can have the lights back on now. As I say, that's a very small sample of the evidence that is available on the linkage between the quantity of money on the one hand and prices on the other. That evidence is available for hundreds of years in many countries, and there are no exceptions. But that only gets you to first base. The question is, why is it that the quantity of money increases relative to output? If you go back 100 years ago, and here in California this is very appropriate to go back a little more than 100 years ago, sometimes the quantity of money increased more rapidly than output because of discoveries of gold or precious metals. As you know, you had the gold rush in California in late 1840s, early 1850s. You had the Australian gold discoveries in the same period in 1850s. And you had a worldwide inflation as a result. In the 1890s to 1913, you had a worldwide inflation because of the perfection of the cyanide process for extracting gold from low-grade ore, which produced an outpouring of gold from South Africa to supplement the gold strikes up in Alaska. Today, you have inflations because governments create a very large quantity of money. The question is, why do governments do that? Now, of course, I say the government does this. That's wrong. The government doesn't do it. You do it. I do it. We, the citizen, do it. We tell the people in Washington, we tell our congressmen and our senators and our representatives, we want you to spend more money on us. But we don't want you to put any taxes on us. Oh, no. We don't want you to levy taxes. We want you to spend more. The real tax on the American people is what government spends. If the federal government spends $450 billion and only raises $400 billion in taxes, who do you suppose who pays that other $50 billion? Do you suppose the tooth fairy does? You pay it, and I pay it. And one of the ways we pay it is by the tax which we call inflation. Inflation is, from this point of view, a form of taxation. If government spends more than it takes in the form of things that are called taxes, it has to meet the difference, either by printing money or by borrowing from the public at large. Printing money is a very attractive device because inflation, from the point of view of a person sitting in Congress or in the Senate, is a wonderful tax. He doesn't have to vote for it. Have you ever known of a congressman who got up and said, I vote to impose a tax in the form of inflation of 10% next year? No, sirree. Inflation is a tax which is imposed without representation and which nobody has to vote for. And of course, it's a marvelous tax from the point of view of a congressman trying to meet the demands of his constituents for more spending.